blind school I went to in the 1950s was very much a boys' school. It took until the 80s for them to allow girls in, and when they did, it caused a storm of controversy. Dire consequences were forecast, and indeed, as predicted, the first pregnancy was not long in arriving. The fact that the school under coeducation is a far more civilised place than the one I attended was not foreseen by all. So perhaps we shouldn't be so surprised that in the Victorian era, the idea of sex between disabled people was anathema. It was a powerful taboo and explains the difficulties we've had in unearthing personal accounts of love, sex and marriage. But they do exist, hidden between the lines of the official reports of 19th century charitable institutions. Our first document, though, comes from Buckingham Palace. It's a contract sent to a group of disabled women sewing glamorous nighties and lingerie for a royal honeymoon.
Miss Matthews, Buckingham Palace. Thanks very much for the selection of nightgowns sent on approval. Her Royal Highness would like 8 made in pink crêpe de chine. I'm enclosing £2 17 in payment of the enclosed bill.
The women sewing these 8 nighties were members of the Girls' Friendly Society, a charity which had been founded in 1875 to help women coming to London. It made a particular attempt to employ women with disabilities in its needlework depot. Vivian Richmond of Goldsmiths, University of London, has been uncovering these documents for us.
It's very poignant because the Girls' Friendly Society Needlework Depot made something of a speciality of producing trousseau for women to take into their marriages. And, of course, these were women who were not likely to marry, had little, if any, expectation of marriage.
Dear Madam, I'm commanded by the Queen to inform you that in no circumstances must any details whatever of the lingerie which you are supplying to Her Royal Highness be given to any press representative. If by any chance a press representative should visit you, you will understand that he or she has no authority to inspect the lingerie.
So they're sewing this sexy material for situations that they're never going to experience or very unlikely to experience.
They're very unlikely to experience it. And there's an interesting comment on the members which talks about how they imagine the joy that these women must feel in handling these beautiful and luxurious materials, which I imagine was in contrast to the rather mundane and prosaic materials of their own clothing.
Were they allowed to have a sexuality of their own?
Any girl who joined the Girls' Friendly Society had to be a virgin, because if she wasn't, then she got thrown out. And there was definitely an idea in the 19th century that disabled women were less likely to marry than their able-bodied sisters.
If you look at the annual reports of charitable schools for disabled people from the 19th century, they take pains to assure their donors that no sex is allowed. They specially reprint certain key school rules, like this one from the Cambrian Institution for the Deaf and Dumb Annual Report, 1888.
Warn him in time against forming any attachment to a born deaf person of the opposite sex. And do not be persuaded that a union with one like himself is the best for him.
Mike Mantin of Swansea University has been researching the history of this Swansea institution and its strictures on sex.
Well, this came amidst a lot of other really mundane general rules. It was just included at the end as hints to parents, alongside things like pack an extra coat and rules like that. But arguably this was influenced perhaps by this idea that deaf people shouldn't be intermarrying for fear of supposedly spreading the deaf race. And we have things in the Royal Commission on the blind, the deaf and dumb and others. They used evidence from doctors and figures, including Alexander Graham Bell, the inventor of the telephone, which warned about schools that use sign language, creating these deaf communities, which would eventually lead to intermarriage and therefore the spread of deafness.
1889. The Royal Commission on the Blind, the Deaf and Dumb, etc. We have observed how the use of signs creates a tendency to live apart as a class rather than to mix with the world, and leads to the intermarriage of the deaf. We think there is sufficient evidence to prove that there is a real danger of an increase in congenital deafness from intermarriage.
What's strange is that the rules in the annual reports, like the one we heard, at the very same time, deaf people were meeting and they were marrying. And we get reports in newspapers of pupils from the school meeting, getting married, and the teacher from the school providing sign language interpretation at the wedding itself. So what's clearly happening is that the school felt the need to address this public fear of deaf intermarriage. But what was actually going on was that they were completely fine with deaf people marrying, and the wedding would have almost certainly been an event for the community of the school.
So what conclusion do we draw from that? That there's complete confusion on this issue?
Possibly not. I think we have these dire, dramatic warnings about deaf intermarriage and about deaf people marrying, but actually behind the scenes, clearly deaf people had the capacity to rebel against that and marry.
And some of the teachers would be going along with it?
Yeah, absolutely.
So it sounds as if there was a difference between the face the institution wanted to present to the public to protect its reputation and therefore its ability to raise money, and what was really going on. The Swansea institution may not have been typical because, unusually, its head teacher was himself deaf. As a result, we get reports like this charming newspaper account of a wedding between two young people who met at the institution.
Western Mail, 6th of April 1904. At Holy Trinity Church, Swansea, on Tuesday morning, the unusual scene was witnessed of a marriage between two deaf mutes. The ceremony was conducted by one of the chaplains of a deaf and dumb institution in London. The whole service, together with questions and answers, was repeated in sign language. "We have had a delightful time," wrote the bridegroom in the course of an interview, conducted by means of written questions and answers. "We can talk on our fingers quite as quickly as people can talk who have speech. I shall never have to complain of my wife's tongue. Enjoy life? Rather," he wrote, and his features show that he was writing the truth. "I can read," he went on. "I can work and make known my wants. What more can a man desire? My affliction has never troubled me, though of course I should like to be as others are. Yet I get on very well as I am."
What's interesting about that is that you can hear the school putting a spin on it, pointing out how respectable their pupils are and how normal. You hear it even in the reported words of the groom. He's come out of an ethos which tells him, have respect for yourself, don't let people put you down. The self-deprecating joke is there. I'll never be annoyed by my wife's voice. And also that very modern-sounding independence. Don't you dare feel sorry for me. I get on very well as I am. It would be great to have his and his wife's account of what sounds like a loving relationship. Sadly, though, we don't. But something real shines through that newspaper report. Despite all the researchers now working across the country on this new history of disability, all we have are tantalising glimpses of the love stories which must exist. What we do have are the official dry and dusty ledgers from institutions, records of who was admitted and who was expelled. And some of those expulsions did have to do with sex. But even in the reports, you get the impression they'd rather think it wasn't happening at all. It's easy to be smug about those prudish Victorians. But I'm not convinced attitudes have changed that much. We are, after all, still trying to do everything we can to prevent the birth of disabled children. But there does seem to have been a particular panic about sex and disability at the end of the 19th century. Joanna Burke is Professor of History at Birkbeck College, London.
This is the period where you're getting the really early days of genetics and genetic understanding. And what this led to was it led to what was called negative eugenics. In other words, the idea that if there was someone in your family who had a particular trait or characteristic, that that person should not be able to marry or reproduce. But it didn't only affect, of course, that person, that disabled person. It also affected their entire family, cousins, second cousins, so that if you had someone in your family who possessed that characteristic, that trait, then you weren't allowed to marry. Your sisters, your brothers, your cousins were not able to marry, all the way down. So it had huge impact on people.
And of course, there's a rather more dramatic, earthy term for it, isn't there? This idea of not marrying the right person.
Yes, bad blood. And this notion that, in the very core of yourself, your blood, that somehow there's something corrupt, there's something dirty.
Well, it's the kind of phrase you can hear people in your mind gossiping about at funerals and weddings and that kind of thing, isn't it? Oh, there's bad blood in that family.
Yes, absolutely. And bad blood, of course, is not only about the body, it's also about the moral, the soul, the spirit. So bad blood permeates everything.
And I mean, is there any science really in bad blood, that literal idea of bad blood?
No, but there is, of course, various characteristics are passed down through our genes, etc. That does happen. But a lot of these ideas actually have no scientific foundation. I'm just thinking about, Marie Stopes, for example, the great birth control advocate of the period, who went into a real tiz about her son who was going to marry a woman who was slightly short-sighted. Indeed, she refused to attend the wedding.
So this was someone who we would have thought of as very liberal, very modern ideas, indeed getting into trouble over her modern ideas, who was actually frightened about this very powerful term you used, bad blood.
Absolutely. I mean, this goes through the entire society. It's not a minority view. It is at the heart of Britain at that period.
A timely reminder, then, that the perfectibility of human beings in your national image was not the preserve of Nazi Germany. The whole of Northern Europe and the United States provided eugenics with a welcome home. We always think of eugenics in racial terms, but fear of disability was a driving force behind it too. And that fear of bad blood lingered on well into the 20th century, certainly into my childhood.